Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special curator's introduction to the exhibition, The World of Stonehenge, a new exhibition that runs between the 17th of February and the 17th of July, and that seeks to explore the times, the people, and the worlds that existed around Stonehenge. This evening, we're going to give you a bit more insight into the exhibition, and I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Wexler this evening. My name is Dr. Neil Wilkin, and together we are the curatorial team for this exhibition. I'm going to pass over to Jennifer to introduce you to the exhibition and some of our thinking behind it.
Thanks, Neil. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So I think we just wanted to kind of introduce the exhibition, some of the ideas behind it in this presentation. You know, as we know, we all feel like we know Stonehenge well. It's kind of that familiar, famous monument. But for many people, it remains a monument that's really quite shadowy. So we really wanted to look at in the exhibition, who are the people who built it and lived in this world, and how can we use Stonehenge as a gateway into it to explore the richness and broadness and connections across that world. So we want to put Stonehenge in context by contextualizing this broader world and looking at this flow of ideas across it, the migration of people and the interconnectedness that we can see across the world by featuring these key objects that are connected to it. And we're really, really lucky because we've been able to get loans from over 30 institutions across the British Isles, Ireland, and Europe. So it's really kind of a spectacular thing to get all these objects in a room together and kind of be able to have these conversations around them. And what we really are trying to do here is explore some of the most important and foundational transformations in Europe, in European and global deep history. And one other thing we wanted to point out is there's no one Stonehenge. It developed over 100 generations, and it has evolved and changed over time. And we'll go into more detail about that a little bit later on. So where do some of our ideas around Stonehenge, or maybe even our stereotypes about Stonehenge, come from? And we just wanted to feature here Stukely, who was an antiquarian from the late 17th, early 18th century, who was one of the first people to actually, you can see in this drawing, study Stonehenge as a site, but also kind of contextualize it within its wider landscape. The downside to this is because of his background, which would have been essentially classical history, so the records passed down to us from people like the Romans, he had a few ideas that we know are not true anymore, and that's the idea that Stonehenge was built by Druids, and he was very invested in this idea. In fact, he even dressed him like a Druid sometimes, and we can see here one of his illustrations of sort of a Druid in his costume at the site. But the thing we really liked about him and we found really inspirational for the exhibition is how he captured this sense of religious spirit and wonder of the monument, and how that creativity, inspiration, imagination of the people who built it, and how this can be used as a tool to really understand the past and, you know, really inspire us in the way we look at monuments such as Stonehenge. So why now? Why are we doing this? This is a question we've been asked a lot. And I mean, one of the key things is it's never been done in London. It's the first exhibition of this kind in Britain in over 35 years. There was an exhibition in National Museum of Scotland almost 40 years ago, and so much has been discovered since then. We have had an actual scientific revolution in archaeology over the last 30 plus years, and so much new research. And we'll go into some of those ideas through this presentation, but we have a chance now to tell this story like never before. So again, we're really lucky, and it is a story that has global impact. It's something that shaped our world as we know it today. One of the really lovely things for us, and this tonight in a sense is kind of a celebration for us, so thank you so much for joining us, is we're just so excited about the wonderful response we've been getting to the exhibition. And we're so happy to be able to share some of these ideas behind it. So I'm just going to pass on to Neil now, because he's going to go into some of the specifics of exhibition sections.
Thank you, Jennifer. So in the exhibition, we cover a huge span of time, a really quite sort of daunting span of time. And we do that because the monument, as Jennifer's mentioned, is built and changes over a long period of time, over many human generations. So in order to put the monument in context, we have to set it in its broader chronological context. And we begin in the exhibition with the introduction of farming from Europe to Britain 6,000 years ago. And we take in the way in which the landscape has changed during that time. And those changes involve the construction of the first monuments in the Stonehenge landscape. Stonehenge wasn't actually the first monument built in that wider landscape. It came somewhat later, about 5,000 years ago. And then 500 years after that, the monument took on the form that you and I would recognize today, those iconic sarsen stones that stand like gateways. But that's somewhat later. And it's around the same time or just after that that we get the introduction of metalworking to Britain, again, brought into Britain from Europe like farming was. And then in the subsequent generations and centuries, the landscape around Stonehenge and indeed across Britain is transformed by the change of exchange and trade that really kicks in about 3,500 years ago until that whole system begins to collapse around 2,800 years ago. So the point we're trying to make in this slide is that the exhibition within its compass can take in an extraordinary range of cultural moments, but also, we think, some of the most important transformations in the history of Britain and Europe. Those are the sort of the big moves that we had to try and convey in the exhibition, and that put the pressure on. But I hope we've been able to achieve some of that in the exhibition and through the objects we're about to introduce you to today. But really, lockdown and COVID, I think, has really made us as a museum and as curators reflect on the time that we're talking about. And the one thing that we've learned by doing this exhibition is that this time, which seems like a long time ago to us, isn't a static and insular time. It's not a time when people are just staying at home alone. It's a time when there's a real drive for connectivity, for people to gather. Stonehenge itself is a place of gathering, and many of the monuments built at the same time around Britain and Ireland and Europe are about coming together, about being together, about meeting, about exchanging of ideas and objects. And in the exhibition, we try and get across how important connectivity was to these people. And we do that through three principal means that we'll touch on both in the presentation and in the exhibition. And that's people's transformative connection to land. When farming comes in, people have to find a new way of interacting with nature, with the woodland. They have to clear the woodland. They have to introduce new crops and animals to that landscape. So their relationship to the land is transformed forever. And it's arguably something that we live with today. And then secondly, we look up at the sky today, many of us, like Jennifer and I from London, and the skies are dimmed by light pollution. But at the time periods that we're talking about, the sky was clear and the sky was a source of wonder. And we try to bring across that in the exhibition. The sun particularly is a real guiding star throughout the exhibition. And then thirdly, and just as importantly, there's a real transformation of people's relationships to one another. And we see that in the way that people presence their ancestors. They put their ancestors into the landscape in the form of the monuments they construct, but also they undertake this sort of really remarkable exchanges and movements of objects between places like France and England or France and Germany. These are long distances, but nonetheless, there were no barriers to these trade and exchange networks. And they were fundamental to how people connected to one another, but also to ideas, to changing religious and social and political ideas. So a real age of connectivity, despite the stereotype of the period, is perhaps being one where people are quite localized and quite stuck in their own areas or their own regions. And the exhibition itself has 6 parts: a beginning and a conclusion, an introduction and a conclusion. And in between, the visitor, if you've been or if you're yet to go, we'll go through 6 different areas of the exhibition. And what we wanted to do is just show you a couple of objects from each of those sections to give you a flavour of the themes and the ideas, and perhaps more importantly, the types of people that you'll meet. Because as Jennifer's mentioned, we want to introduce you to the people of Stonehenge, not just the shadowy monument. To begin at the beginning, I mentioned that the introduction of farming is fundamental to the story of Stonehenge. But before farming, there are hunter-gatherers and fishers who live in Britain and who have a fascinating relationship with nature, one that's very much in tune with the natural world. And this is demonstrated beautifully, I think, by this headdress that would have been worn on the crown of somebody's head and allowed that person wearing this object to become almost half human, half deer. This was in a time when people had a really close relationship with the natural world. They followed the migration of animals. They saw themselves almost through animal eyes at times. It's a really fascinating glimpse of this very different relationship to the natural world. And in the exhibition, we've been able to bring that headdress, which I just showed you, which was found in North Yorkshire, together with another example of one of these headdresses that's actually from Germany. It's a very similar idea of crowning your head with an antler. But in this case, it was buried with a fascinating woman who was decorated with many different bones of wild animals. And we think that she was probably a shaman. She was able to communicate with wild animals and perhaps also the spirits and the supernatural powers. So despite the long distances that you can see in this map between Starcar, where the first headdress I showed you was found, and Bad Durenberg, where this amazing woman was buried, despite the distances, people were sharing these ideas about their connection to the natural world. And that's something we introduced you at the beginning of the exhibition. But even at this very early phase, the Stonehenge landscape was seen as an important place. And around this time, around 8,000 BC, people were raising totem pole-like posts close to where Stonehenge would eventually be built several thousand years later. And we find that fascinating, that even in a world that doesn't have farmers yet and doesn't have monuments yet, this landscape was important. It has deep roots, and that's the idea that we want to get across. But with the introduction of farming comes a new range of people who migrate from areas like France, but with them they bring new objects. And some of these objects are really very seductive, and you can almost understand why a hunter-gatherer could be drawn over to this new way of farming life when you see some of the objects that they introduce. And the jade axe, the jadeite axe, is a perfect example of this. And we're able to show several beautiful examples in the exhibition. These were quarried from the high Alps of northern Italy, and then they were traded and exchanged down trade routes into places like Britain, as far north as Britain, with these first farmers. And they're almost sort of slices of Italian style, almost sort of objects of seduction that traveled with these first farmers, and that represent the long journeys and the links that these farming communities had with other parts of Europe. Beautiful objects, and probably quarried from the high Alps, because the top of these mountains were close to the heavens, close to the gods. So it sort of supercharged these objects with this new power. But they're also a symbol of a new way of life, of deforesting, of cutting down the trees to make way for the crops and the animals that farmers were bringing. So they were really symbolic as well as a functional object, the axe at this time. But the English and the British were not to be outdone. This is an example. This is an image of the High Alps. But in North Yorkshire, in Northern England, in the Lake District, these early farmers came across another source of greenstone, and this almost replaced the jade as the type of material that these farming communities wanted to possess in their axe. And this example from Ironside Tarn in Cumbria is made of this new greenstone, which is from the Langdale Pikes. And any of you who know the Lake District will know that it's a fantastic range of mountains. And this particular axe comes from the high lake district. So very similar to the jade axe in coming from a place high, close to the heavens, close to the gods. And it's around this time that the first farmers begin to construct the first monuments in the Stonehenge landscape. So about 5,000 years ago, we start to see the first Stonehenge. And what people are doing here is actually very similar to what they're doing with the stone axes brought from the High Alps. What they're doing is bringing an important source of stone to Stonehenge. In this case, they're bringing the blue stones from Wales, so a distance of about 350 kilometers. They're bringing these blue stones right across Wales and England to erect at this site on Salisbury Plain. And we think it's very similar to the idea of the axe from the high place. It's about bringing an important source of stone that means something to you all the way from the source to this new location. And what we might be seeing here are people bringing the stone from their ancestral homeland in West Wales to a new home, a new territory, a new land on Salisbury Plain, and building those monuments in this new landscape. So an astonishing example of people bringing stone over a long distance because of its importance to them as an ancestral material, or a material that was charged with meaning. And this is just to give you a sense of the type of route that these people perhaps took, dragging these blue stones 350 kilometers over land and water to raise them at Stonehenge. And while we might not understand the full reasons for that, what we can be clear on is that people were clearly full of inspiration, full of a religious belief that doing this act, undertaking this journey, must have been meaningful, must have been something that would give them a positive outcome, give them favor with the gods or with the ancestors. It's a really amazing feat of pilgrimage and of construction and engineering. But that first monument isn't just a place of gathering or ceremony, it's also, believe it or not, a cemetery. And we have evidence of about 150 to 200 people being buried at this first Stonehenge. And in the exhibition, we're able to show some of the finest grave goods from that first cemetery. And the little stone mace head in the bottom left, that was made from a banded gneiss, a type of stone that was probably originally from northwest Scotland. So we already see at this early point in the narrative connections between Stonehenge and other parts of Britain and beyond. And that really takes us into the second part of the exhibition, where we explore long distance connections between people through particularly the art of the time. This is a time when there's a series of artistic motifs that are made, often geometric patterns or spirals and swirls, and we find those across Britain and Ireland at key religious sites. And the image here shows you some of those motifs that are carved into the wonderful chamber tomb of Newgrange in the Boyne Valley, the Bruna Boyne. And in the exhibition, we have some of the portable objects from these wonderful tombs decorated with this new type of art, including the Knowth mace head, which is a wonderful loan from the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin. And this mace head, which is carved beautifully from a piece of flint, it shows first of all the artistic motifs of the time, but it may well also show a human face. You can perhaps make it out, this spiral pattern for the eyes, the shaft hole for the mouth, and perhaps also the trace of hair and even a beard on the chin. So although this was a time of abstract art, people were sneaking in these little nods to figurative art, to the human form. And it's really fascinating to sort of trace those connections from 5,000 years ago in the art of the period. And the same type of art is found in different medium, in different materials across Britain and Ireland. And from East Yorkshire, the same motifs are found on these chalk cylinders or sculptures that are buried with a child who was aged between 5 and 6 years old. And these chalk objects were buried around their body, perhaps to protect them. So the same sort of art, perhaps with a religious meaning, found in different mediums and different materials across Britain and Ireland. And the same goes for the northeast of Scotland, where instead of making these chalk cylinders or the mace heads, people instead are making these really enigmatic and mysterious stone balls that are carved often out of very hard geologies. And these are decorated with the same spirals and motifs. Their function remains mysterious, but arguably they're about they're as much about the making as they are about a function. And perhaps we could see them as a kind of prehistoric rosary bead, something that you would turn in your hand, something perhaps you would even meditate or think through different ideas in the course of carving one of these balls. So they seem to have a ceremonial and a religious connection to them, even though we don't quite know how they were used. And they're wonderful objects. And in the exhibition, we're lucky enough to have about 20. Again, loans from the National Museum of Scotland. And then I mentioned the second sort of key phase of Stonehenge, when the sarsen stones are raised. And this is a time when we really see the importance of the sun. Many people ask us, what's the sun got to do with Stonehenge? And the answer to that is that around this time, particularly when the sarsens were raised about 4,500 years ago, and it took the form that we tend to recognize today, the key alignment of the monument was with midwinter and midsummer sunrise and sunset. Those were the key alignments at the site, and they're enshrined in the very architecture of the monument. So the sun is critical, and it's really important that because early farming communities relied on the sun for to mark the passage of the seasons, to mark key events when they could gather and hold festivals, and also because they relied upon the passage of the sun for their own fertility, the fertility of the crops and the animals that gave them life. So the sun is a key motif that runs through the exhibition. And we couldn't bring Stonehenge itself to the exhibition, but what we have been able to bring, and we're really grateful to Lynn Museum in Norfolk in England to allowing us to do this, is to bring key elements of a monument known as Seahenge to the exhibition. And this is a wonderful timber circle rather than stone. And it was constructed using these oak posts. And the connection to Stonehenge is that while Stonehenge would have been a large shrine or temple for a big community being drawn across large areas of England and even Britain, Seahenge is a much smaller monument that's more suited to a community or even a family who are gathering. So it's a more intimate, personal monument, but it hopefully gives visitors a sense of the fact that there were other circles made of stone and timber across Britain and Ireland. And within the exhibition, and it has to be seen to really get the full impact of it, we've managed to align the monument on our sun installation so that you see the sun rising and setting through the doorway to the monument, as it would have been seen when the monument was constructed in 2049 BC. So I'm now going to pass over to Jennifer to take us into the age of metal and how that transforms the world of Stonehenge.
Thanks, Neil. So that's a perfect introduction to where we're entering now, which is the cosmos at the heart of the exhibition. And we're going into that world of the universe and connecting upwards. And what's happening now is that when metal, particularly gold, comes onto the scene around 4,500 years ago, people were suddenly able to possess and contain the power of the sun like never before. This provided the means of translating the cosmological beliefs enshrined in Stonehenge and other monuments like it, as Neil just pointed out, into a range of portable objects as never seen before. This is obviously most dramatically seen by the Never Sky disc shown here. This bronze and gold disc is the first physical map of the cosmos, essentially the night sky. It's also the first time it's ever been on display in the British Isles, so it's a wonderful thing that we were able to get through our partnership with Halle Museum in Germany. And I should say, Neil will give a bit more information about this, but we're having a special event around the cosmology on the 3rd of March, and will feature a lot more information on the Never Sky Disc. But you can see here that we have our lovely courier from Halle holding up this amazing disc. And it's sort of a dinner plate sized, I guess you could say, but it really gives you that sense how suddenly the sort of meaning and the connection to the universe moves from these communal monuments to an individual, powerful object that can be held and possessed in a completely new way. So we kind of start to get the sense of the rise of the individual, perhaps, or at least individuals or communities that can directly control the power of the sun in a completely different way than what we've seen before. So just a little bit more about the details of the Never Sky Disc. It dates to nearly 1,000 years after the final phase of Stonehenge, and it was found in Germany, but it expands essentially the astronomical alignments we already see in monuments such as Stonehenge. So again, we see that movement from sort of places in the landscape marking these important points in the season, such as the solstices, into this type of object. And the reason these are so key is that these are key moments in the seasonal calendar for the farming communities. Their livelihoods and their lives really depend on connecting to the sun and the power of the sun to grow their crops, to raise their animals, and the sort of fear around that disappearing or not being able to control that, it was a real thing. So these are powerful emotional objects. If we look at the actual details of the monument, and you can see here we have a small diagram, the bands sort of that you can see on the outer edge, so there was 2 gold bands, one unfortunately is missing, but on the outer edge of the disc actually mark the positions of the rising and setting sun over the course of the solar year, so at midsummer and midwinter, just like Stonehenge, as you can see in this diagram. In the center, there's a distinctive rosette of 7 stars, which represents the Pleiades constellation. These stars actually mark the beginning and the end of the farming year in Europe. So when they appear and disappear in the sky, essentially is the start and the end of the farming year. They also play a key role in quite a complex rule that connects the shorter lunar year to keep in step with the solar year, which is longer. And basically, I won't go into too much detail because it is very complex, but a leap month should be added every 3rd year if a crescent moon, a few days old, appears next to the Pleiades in the springtime sky. So we think that actually that is what is being shown by the sort of full moon and crescent moon on the disc. It could potentially be a sun as well, we're not completely sure, but we think really the disc is focused on the night sky. At the bottom is a very late addition, and I should say the disc was altered many times over quite a few centuries and used in many different ways. And I won't go into details now, but at the bottom there is a very late addition which we connect to a possible solar boat, which is again connected to mythology around how the sun moved through the sky over the course of a day. Something really intriguing about this object and why it's so great to have it in the exhibition is it's truly an international object. The bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin, comes from Central Europe, probably from Germany, but the gold on it we know comes from Cornwall, so it has actually British roots as well. It is certainly the star of the show, and I hope you all get a chance to see it. It's truly amazing seeing it in person. So in this section, alongside the Never Sky Disc, we have these other really beautiful, amazing, quite blingy gold objects, including these incredible hats that come from France and Germany. We sort of joke that it's a wizard hat or Harry Potter sorting hat, because it kind of looks a little bit like that. They are slightly strange objects. We're not completely sure how they were used. Perhaps they were worn by a person, perhaps they were used in a shrine. We're not completely sure, but we know the motifs on them, those series of dots you can see in the photograph, probably encode cosmological ideas and solar imagery. And you can imagine that if a person was wearing this, it would imbue them with such great power because they would be wearing the power of the sun as their hat reached up to the heavens. So they're really these magical, awe-inspiring objects. We also have a large selection of these beautiful gold collars, which are some of the earliest gold objects we get in the British Isles, largely from Ireland, actually. And you can see they're really stunning. We call them lunulas because of the shape, but really they're just gold collars. So you would have worn them around your neck. But they have these intricate decoration along their edges. You can see, but the centers were kept plain, and all of them have the same stylistic motif. So you have to ask yourself, why have the artists kind of been restrained? It's a very modern idea to keep that middle section blank. And we think it was to kind of embody and reflect the sun. And again, the wearers of these really rare and precious objects would have been wearing the power of the sun. And you can imagine someone walking around and it having that reflection. So again, these are very powerful objects. And the interesting thing about that is this is another type of collar that we find from Ireland, but it's over 1,000 years later. So these ideas persist. It's not sort of a one-off. We see these kind of powerful ideas kind of evolving and changing and developing further over time. So it's something that is a theme that runs throughout our exhibition. In the last part of the section, we're really lucky to feature some really fascinating new finds from Denmark. And they're pretty special. Again, they've never been displayed outside of Denmark, as far as we know. And what they depict is sort of a mythological cycle around the sun and the movement of the sun over the course of a day, and how that movement is actually connected to a series of different animals. And in the exhibition, we actually have a lovely animation that shows this cycle, so to kind of decode it for the visitors. But the amazing thing about it is that these types of myths, and even some of the objects, a lot of people, when you see them, you think it's something that might be in the classical or medieval world, but the origins go back almost 4,000 years ago. So we have these kind of mythological ideas developing much earlier than we originally thought. So about 1,500 years after farming was established in the British Isles, we get another big change. We get a new group of people, which often are referred to as sort of beaker people, coming over from Europe, mostly the Netherlands. And they are connected to this new technology, which is metalworking, primarily bronze, but also a new type of burial that actually features individuals. And we haven't really seen this very much up until this point. So we think there's this kind of ideology of the individual, which seems to kind of go along with the rise of metalwork. And what we're showing here is one of the earliest types of these graves that we have in the British Isles. This grave was found very close to Stonehenge, and it's called the Amesbury Archer. And we call it the Amesbury Archer because he has an archer's kit with him. You can see the arrowheads up in the sort of top left corner. So we know that was sort of a special identity, a high status identity, almost like a knight at that time. So this person was already kind of being marked out as a special person. And the other interesting thing about this burial is that he was probably one of the first metal workers to come to Britain. And we know that because he has a metalworking kit with him, buried with him. And you can see he has a sort of, in this lower, in the top right corner, you can see it's this small black, it's actually a mini anvil for working metal. And also he has these small copper daggers, so a very early type of metalwork, as well as these small gold hairbands, which were some of the earliest gold pieces we've found archaeologically. So we know he was possibly bringing some of this metalwork with him, but he also, from studying his DNA and the chemical residue in his bones and his teeth, we know that he actually came from the Alps, from the Swiss Alps. So he undertook this extraordinary journey all the way to Stonehenge, possibly with a family, possibly with a group of people, and moved into that area and was eventually buried and honored by having a very special burial by the monument. So it's an extraordinary thing that we suddenly know from all this new scientific research that people are moving quite far distances over a long period of time and bringing these new ideas and new technology with them. So it's a really fascinating story to tell, and it's quite a new story that we're telling here, because we didn't have a lot of this technology a few years ago. At this time, it's quite an interesting thing. It's almost like Stonehenge becomes a place everyone wants to be buried. So the sort of formal building of the monument is done, but it seems to acquire burials around it. And sort of a good analogy that Neil and I sometimes use, it's almost like Westminster Abbey. You know, you have the building, you have the temple that everyone knows about, is famous, and then people start burying themselves in it to acquire status and kind of, you know, religious connection to that place. And this is really one of the most fantastical burials in that region. It's called Bush Burial. And if you visit the monument and you look out from the circle, you can see a high ridge, and there's a series of very, very large burial mounds. And this is one of the most prominent ones. It's really actually a monument in its own right. So this man was, you know, essentially, potentially one of the last quote unquote priests who, you know, possibly controlled access or ran rituals at this monument. And the reason we think that is because of some of the amazing objects he's buried with. He had this large gold lozenge, and you can see in the drawing found on his chest. He had a gold belt hook around his waist. He also had a fossilized flint mace head, which is potentially a symbol of power. But the sort of interesting thing, really interesting thing about him is he also had long distance connections from some of his objects, showing potentially, you know, extended relationships to the continent. And the reason we know that is because he has these couple daggers, which actually are of a French type, potentially imported from France. One of the daggers has remains of an amazing handle with gold inlaid sort of studs, which actually connect to a style of inlay that we see in the Mediterranean. So quite long distance connections possibly. And so this man is possibly has spiritual power connected to the power of Stonehenge, which obviously remains important to people for a very long time after the final stage of it being built. But he also has suddenly these long distance connections to the continent and beyond, around the trade of metalwork and sort of the status that gets connected to that. And that is really where the exhibition moves from there, which essentially we move away from the Stonehenge landscape, from Salisbury Plain, and the importance of these large monuments and even these important burials to the south coast of England and trade and exchange. And we see a real cultural change that people suddenly, the emphasis moved beyond these monuments and into this broader world. People are looking outward, and they're trying to connect to the neighbors across the channel. And why are they trying to connect to them? Because they want to get these exotic goods. They want to get exotic bronze materials and good exotic other materials. And in this slide, we're showing at the top left the remains of an amazing shipwreck from Langdon Bay, which is just by the cliffs of Dover, which actually shows that we get kind of quite standardized types of trading. So we're getting types of objects that are made in a standardized shape and weight in bronze for across from France, and then we know are being melted down and used to create other objects in England at this time. So we're getting these standardized trade routes, and we have multiple shipwrecks along the south coast. Some of these are actually going to acquire raw materials from places like Cornwall, where you have amazing tin sources, and some of them are kind of bringing materials back. So there is this back and forth. And something that's really interesting at this period is you get that kind of idea of the importance and the power of these heroic journeys and going outwards and getting these new materials. And you get almost the boat as this special symbol. And in the lower right corner, we have these amazing gold boat models from Denmark, which kind of connect to that idea of the heroic voyage and the voyage into the unknown and the spiritual voyage that maybe people were taking to get materials, but also from a symbolic, heroic way. And the other thing we're starting to get with all this amazing bronze material is really sophisticated objects. such as this cuirass from France. This is made of sheep bronze, and it would have been incredibly tricky to make. So people are really getting talented at making amazing bronze objects, but they're also kind of getting this a sense of that martial identity becomes the glamour of the warrior, if that makes sense. So it's almost an extension of the archer identity we have earlier on, but it becomes sort of really increased. And Neil and I always joke that this is sort of like Brad Pitt and Troy. You know, it's that kind of heroic soldier that you would think of in a film, but you would think of it in ancient Mediterranean, not so much in, you know, northern France. So it really, people start to take on these identities. And one of the reasons that they're starting to take on these identities is because people are starting to scuffle over the trade and actually fight over these resources, and sometimes to very grim outcomes. But we didn't want to end on something grim. We also wanted to show how the homes and settlements become really important. And from an archaeological perspective, it is the period of time where we see a blossoming of houses. So we get this domestic world and this domestic life in a way we've never seen before. And really the best example of this, and we're so honored to be able to feature this material in the exhibition, is the material from Muss Farm, which is an amazing late Bronze Age settlement. So it dates about 3,000 years ago, or just under 3,000 years ago, in the Fenlands, so in Cambridgeshire, close to Peterborough. And it was a settlement, short-lived, only a year old, of a small cluster of houses over a marshland, and it caught fire. We don't know if potentially even was put on fire through arson. We're not really sure if there was some conflict involved, but it caught fire and it sunk very quickly into the mud of the marsh, and it preserved this amazing organic world like we've never seen before. So for archaeologists, this has been an absolute treasure trove, and it's really amazing to get this material on display. It was only been excavated a few years ago. And here we have an axe, which is a bronze axe, but it hafted, so it has a wooden handle. So we really get a sense of how people would use these tools. And this was actually deposited under one of the houses. So maybe as a sort of, a lucky charm to protect the house, because we know metalwork had a lot of significance and sort of symbolism at this time. So perhaps this was kind of, your deposit you gave into the marsh, you donated to it to watch over you. We don't know. But you also get a sense of this amazing organic world that we never get. And here we have a small bobbin that has thread made of thistle. So it's very, very fine. So these people were making incredibly sophisticated clothing, as well as they were getting materials such as these beautiful beads that actually came from Turkey and Egypt. So even though they live in this very local world with local resources, they also have these kind of long distance connections. I think I will pass back over to Neil to talk about the end of the exhibition.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we've been on a journey, really, very quick run through of what is an expansive exhibition, and Jennifer's talked us through those transformations in the Stonehenge landscape over long sweeps of time, and how we can chart the history of Britain and Europe somehow through the changing fortunes of the monument, which is what we try and do in the show. We felt it was important to end on a high note, and when you come to the exhibition, the final object you'll see is this beautiful gold object, which is really only about sort of 8 centimeters across. It's a small little piece of gold working perfection, and we call it the Shropshire Sun Pendant. It was found a couple of years ago in the Shropshire Marches by a metal detectorist, and followed up by excavation by the British Museum. And this object really sums up some of the key themes and ideas that we explore in the exhibition. That's because, firstly, it's a remarkably sophisticated piece of gold working, one that goldworkers today are really struggling to understand and to replicate. And what that tells us is really that our stereotypes about this time as being one that's primitive or simple, we have to throw those out, because really this is a time when people were capable of extraordinary skill, but also extraordinary imagination and creativity. And the second point to make is that this object really sums up the connectivity of the time. So this object found in Shropshire is similar to other examples that have been found in Ireland, and even to the bulla, the type of pendant worn by Etruscan, so pre-Roman civilization, around the same time that the pendant was made, about 1000 BC. So that sense of connectivity across Britain, Ireland, and Europe is there in that object too. And then finally, the importance of the sun. So we think that these motifs, these gold triangles engraved into the surface, we think that those represent the setting or rising sun. And that's something that, as we've seen, and Jennifer's mentioned, runs through the whole of the exhibition. So I'm just going to conclude by saying that really each generation, or every generation, has the Stonehenge it deserves or desires. And really we hope that when you come, and if you come to the exhibition, or if you've been, that you'll leave with a sense of what that Stonehenge means, what Stonehenge and what that time means to you. For Jennifer and I, it's a sense of creativity and imagination that inspires us, because we think that's something that we can learn going forward into the future from the people who built this extraordinary monument and the many objects that are shown in the exhibition. And then finally, we wanted to stop and say that really this exhibition is only possible because we were able to bring together loans from around 36 different lenders across Britain and Europe. And that really is the only thing that makes exhibitions on this scale possible. So we're really grateful to all of those individuals. Let me introduce a couple of questions that I've received. One which I'll ask to Jennifer first is, what does a henge mean? You know, we've mentioned Stonehenge and we've mentioned Seahenge. What is a henge?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually something, if you have a look, we wrote a sort of opening blog for the exhibition. So we have a little bit of information there if you're interested. It's a funny term. It's an antiquarian term, and it actually was coined by an ex-British Museum curator in, was it the 1920s?
I think the 1930s, actually.
1930s. So, so actually it has a British Museum connection. But essentially it refers to a space that is enclosed by a ditch and a bank. So even though they generally enclose a circle, a stone circle, a timber circle, it actually refers to that enclosing element rather than what's inside the circle. So for archaeologists, really it means sort of a space that was considered a ritual space or a sort of sacred, holy space to people of this period of time, 5,000, 4,000 years ago.
Thanks, Jennifer. And then another question, which I'll also ask to you, and that is the location of Stonehenge. What do we know about why it was built at that precise point on Salisbury Plain? Someone's asked. Why there and not, a kilometre to the east?
That's a really interesting question. And I think it's something you actually touched on a little bit, Neil. We know already, if you go back into the period of hunter-gatherers, so, before farming came over 6,000 years ago, already this was a place that probably at the end of the last ice age was a bit more open. At the time, most of the British Isles would have been heavily wooded, so it's a bit more open and was already being marked as an important place in the landscape. But interestingly, also after the Ice Age, we have natural geological features that were formed essentially from the glaciers departing the region, which left these striations in the ground, which were visible, and they had natural solstice alignment. So we think there's these natural features that people actually were noticing quite early on. And there are monuments in the Stonehenge landscape, and it's something we talk about in the exhibition, that already, before they build Stonehenge, are already aligning with these important sort of solstice moments in the year. So we think it's something that's coming back and marking in different ways over different periods of time, but because there's a geology there that kind of shows it to them, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I'll take a question which was about my map of the bluestones and the route which they went on. The map I showed is based on some new research and work that's been done by Dr. Mike Pitts, who's also the editor of British Archaeology magazine. So some of you might have see it in the publication. Mike's just got a new book out, which is called How to Build Stonehenge. And what he's done, and we were able to draw on this when we were developing the exhibition, is he's thought a lot about logistics and about routeways that they could have, the people building Stonehenge using the bluestones from Wales could have taken. And really, I would recommend that route for why the overland route is more sort of probable or attractive than the sea route. But of course, what we must admit is that we can't pinpoint the exact route they took. I think what we can all agree on is that whatever route the stones came by, it's a remarkable achievement to be able to bring them so far at that early date without access to roads and so on. So the next question is taking us further north up to Scotland. Somebody's asked, what size or how big are the carved stone balls? Jennifer, I don't know if you want to mention the different range of sizes that we have on display and that exist.
I mean, they tend to be, I guess you could say hand-sized. They do vary a bit, and I think that's the thing about them. If you see them, and I will say when we were installing them, I held every single one of them because they're so tactile. And I think the point you made, Neil, about that kind of almost like they're prayers or rosary beads, you can understand how you just want to hold them and touch them. I mean, they may have had a more practical use. It's been suggested possibly wrapping ropes around them to even use as kind of like a sling, maybe for killing animals, something like that. But we don't completely know. And I think one of the really lovely stories that you sort of hit on when you're discussing them was one of the balls we feature is, if you look at it really closely, it's highly polished. And the reason it's highly polished is because it was found by a family in Orkney about 100 years ago. And they put it in their box, their prayer box with their Bible. And when they would have their sort of daily prayer session, they would take out their Bible and the ball and they would handle it as part of their praying. So you really get that sense of that tactile nature of these objects. And they are really stunning, but they're also all very individual as well.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories as well about the objects in the exhibition in terms of its later life. I mean, there are other objects. There's a jade axe on display that was one of those wonderful first sort of farmers' objects made of jade from the Alps. And this one from Scotland had a silver trim applied to the outside of the axe, and it was carried by I think a Scottish soldier as a way of warding against kidney disease. So the idea that these objects exist only in prehistory is just not true. They have afterlives, they are biographies, and they have later histories as well. So it's wonderful modern resonances in some of the objects that we've got on display. Okay, one other thing I should point to on someone else has asked about carved stone balls and how they link to Stonehenge. So something we were trying to pull out in the first section of the first part of the PowerPoint of presentation tonight was that there's a shared series of symbols that are found at religious sites across Britain and Ireland at this time. So while there's no stone balls from Stonehenge, there are examples of pottery that are decorated with very similar motifs to the motifs that we find on the carved balls and that we find in East Yorkshire on the chalk drums. So there's a real sense of people sharing in a symbolic, decorative, artistic language, if you like. And today we can't read that language, but we can see that there's this sort of shared sense of motif, of form, of a kind of artistic repertoire. And that's really what allows us to make those connections between people that are visiting Stonehenge and people that are going up to Orkney. And we think it's quite likely that people could have made journeys really over long distances between places like the Stones of Stoness and up in Orkney and big stone circles down south in Avebury. So people making those sort of pilgrimages, much like people in later medieval Europe made these pilgrimages. So that was something we maybe didn't quite have the time to bring out, but something that is a big part of the exhibition and of the catalogue of the book that accompanies it. Okay, anyway, on to the next question. I'll put this to Jennifer, who I know has an interest in this sort of issue. So ritual practices. David Lewis Williams associates geometric forms in caves with the use of psychedelics by prehistoric people, what they call the first stage of trance. Is there any evidence of use of drugs in the religious places that we've been talking about tonight?
That's a very interesting question. And actually, I have read some of his theories. And I don't know of any sort of residues that we have found at some of the sites, but there is some people who look at there's a sort of real growth in the amount of barley they grow, which is around the sort of Beaker period. So when we get that changeover to the first metal workers, so just after sort of 4,500 years ago, and there's a kind of an explosion in barley grow, and a lot of times because the Beaker pots have a kind of, they're almost like a big, like a pint glass sort of in a sense, and some of them even have handles which look a bit like a beer mug. So there's the idea that maybe they were growing the barley to make fermented beverages, essentially making some kind of beer. But another theory is that possibly there's a particular fungus which grows on the barley and has kind of psychedelic properties, and that is a known thing from sort of shaman practices that still sort of existed in the start of the 20th century in some parts of Europe. So there is potential they were using this material, but we don't completely know for sure. We don't completely have the evidence. But one of the really amazing things is with a lot of the new science that's been developed, we can do a lot more residue analysis. So we actually might get some more insights around this kind of thing in the future.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And then I think we've got time for one final question, which is quite a nice way to end, which is, I think we probably both have to answer this. If we've been putting on the exhibition 20 years ago, how different would the stories we could tell have been? And if I can start, I think the stories would be very different. And I think the difference is that maybe 20 years ago, we would have focused on the bling, the gold, and what that tells us about power and status. I think those are key parts of what we're doing in the exhibition. But what we're trying to also do is pan out to the wider world, the sort of everyday life, really, by showing other materials like the wood of Stonehenge or many other organic objects that we have in the exhibition. And also we want to focus more on people and the stories of people. And that's being allowed, as Jennifer's mentioned, through new scientific techniques that allow us to follow migration and mobility and even what people ate. So really the science is really pushing forward a more personal and almost more historic version of history, where we can talk about how people are related to one another, whether people are brother and sister, father and son. And I think in 20 years' time, the exhibitions that people hold will be much more personal and feel much more like the historic periods that we're used to reading about than prehistory, if you like. Jennifer, do you have anything that you think sums up what we've done and how it?
I think you cover most of it. I think the idea of migration has massively changed in just, to be honest, the last couple years, the last 5 years, and that's primarily due to this a lot of this DNA and chemical analysis, which we call isotope analysis, which really lets us show and track the movement of people. But we're starting to get a more complex picture of that. So really interesting ideas, as you mentioned, Neil, some of the burials around Stonehenge, that you can actually map family groups across that and social relationships. So it's not just purely about this, it's probably not this invasion. It's actually probably groups of people moving around and having personal connections. So you get a much deeper.
Yeah, we're starting to see the kind of complexity of the times in much more fine-grained way than we were ever possible before, when we used to be very sort of clumsy ways of describing social cultural change. Now we're starting to get into the real detail, which I think is so exciting and bodes well for the future. So yeah, the future curators 20 years have got another great exhibition hopefully to stage, but I hope that people visiting the exhibition that's on at the British Museum until the 17th of July will find the one that's currently on really stimulating and exciting. And it really just it's left for me to just make an announcement about the next event, which is part of a series of really exciting talks that are happening from now until until July. And that's happening on the 3rd of March at 5:30 p.m., also on Zoom. And that's called Concepts of Cosmos in the World of Stonehenge. And that will be a fantastic discussion between Harold Meller, Professor Harold Meller from Hala, who is the leading expert on the Nebra sky disk, and Professor Timothy Darville of Bournemouth, who's a leading expert on Stonehenge. And they'll be talking about the calendrical interpretations of both the sky disk and Stonehenge and finding kind of common ground. And that will be chaired by the keeper of the Department of Britain, Europe and Prehistory at the British Museum, Dr. Jill Cook. So it's going to be a really sort of wonderful opportunity to make those links that Jennifer's just touched on tonight about that Nebra disc, the poster object, the star object of the show, Stonehenge, the monument. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we hope you enjoy both the exhibition and the future events that form part of the series that are coming next. So good night to everyone.
Thank you.